So thank you, Nancy, and thank you everyone who's worked really hard to put this presentation together and get the word out. I know there's been a lot of flyers that have been distributed and websites and emails that have been issued. So thank you for that. So again, I will start just giving a little bit of background on the landmarking process, the process that we've been going through and the research that we're doing specifically related to Belgrave Motors and where we are to date. Andrew and I gave a presentation a few weeks ago. This is a little bit of an updated version because since then we've found some additional information. We're also working with some very credentialed experts and consultants who are helping us find this information. So this is an ongoing process. So we'll start with what is the National Register of Historic Places? This is the office, this is the official list of the nation's historic places. This was authorized by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. It essentially states that historic property significant to the nation's heritage are being lost or substantially altered, often inadvertently with increasing frequency. In the ever face of increasing extensions of urban centers, highways, and residential, commercial, industrial developments, the present governmental and non-governmental historic programs are inadequate to ensure future generations a genuine opportunity to appreciate and enjoy the rich heritage of our nation. So the important thing is that the National Register essentially catalogs and provides guidelines on how to list a property on the National Register. So each state has a preservation office which receives nominations and evaluates them for eligibility. This typically comes from property owners, historical societies, preservation organizations, etc. In New York State, we have the New York State Historic Preservation Office, and they have guidelines and criteria in order to establish these for this nomination. They help individuals and communities identify, evaluate, and preserve cultural resources. New York State had a Historic Preservation Act, which was established in 1980. New York State also maintains the CRIS system, which is the Cultural Resource Information System. You can see the website above. If anybody's interested, this will be recorded. You can always go and log in. This is all public record. So again, the state maintains this database and it catalogs properties that have been reviewed for eligibility, who have been denied eligibility for the National Register, who have been determined to be eligible and are actually listed on the register. So this is just a snapshot of that screen. Again, the website is above. This shows Great Neck Plaza and adjacent Thomaston. So you can see Great Neck Plaza is very diligent about cataloging and documenting and reporting their buildings. In Thomaston, we have a few properties, one being Belgrave Motors, which is this green dot here. So green means essentially that it's been reviewed by the state and it's been determined to be eligible for the listing on the National Register. So this is actually the document that we could see if we log into the website. The criteria for the state are A, B, C, and this has been determined under criterion C, which means that this property embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, method, or period or method of construction and represents the work of a master, or possesses high artistic values, or represents a significant and distinguishable entity whose component may lack individual distinction. Specifically, it's talking about Tudor Revival style. Many early buildings in the area used the Tudor Revival style, which was popular in new suburban developments in the region during the period. The automobile played an important role in facilitating suburban growth during this time. The use of the Tudor Revival style it lent a sense of tradition and respectability to the modern form of construction, of transportation technology. So now we'll just talk a little bit about the history and the evolution of Belgrave Square. This is a very early map, 1909, of Belgrave Square. We can see that this is this little orange dotted line. It's not there yet. It was a farm, it was Allen Farm. And this is Great Neck Plaza. So much of Great Neck Plaza was developed by the Grace family. They also owned Belgrave Square. They purchased this in the teens. It was under a subsidiary company, which was called Belgrave Realty Inc. By the 1920s, 1925 and 27, this property was transferred to the son of Grace, Joseph Grace, and he essentially started to subdivide these pieces of land and sell them off to developers, creating now what is today known as Belgrave Square. So we can see here on the property, this was one of the earliest properties that was subdivided. And in 1926, a single family house was constructed on this property. So this corner lot is where Belgrave Motors currently stands. This house was relocated, according to Great Neck, onto Brompton Road for the purposes of constructing this apartment building. So we now know, based on Nassau County records and Great Neck records, that in October of 1928, this apartment building, which is the Belgrave Apartments, was under construction. It was based upon the newspapers and the Nassau County records. We know that the property was owned and developed by Mordav Holdings. This is again a further developed map, now showing the construction of Belgrave Motors in 1931. We know that the president of Mordav Holdings now was Morris Lefkowitz, and the secretary was Lois M. Wolf. Morris, the Lefkowitz family and the Wolf family were very close to the Grace family, and they were very prominent families in the village. So this is just a little bit of a zoomed in Sanborn map indicating the detail of the building that we're able to start to understand the history here. It was important to note that there was newspaper articles that the residents of the Belgrave Square area were very concerned about the construction of a commercial building in the bounds or the confines of their neighborhood. So eventually this was approved. I suspect that they built a fireproof building because it was within the confines of a residential district. One of the caveats was that it couldn't be a single-story building. It had to be a two-story building, so it had to be something that was, a little bit more substantial than just a single-story commercial facility. So this map here tells us about the stair towers, the window configurations, even the wall thicknesses. So we have a lot of detail as to the construction of the building. We also were able to understand the construction types. It was built with cast-in-place concrete, brick and reinforced concrete, which is very progressive for that time. They have the 4 towers, skylights, wrought iron balconies. It's also important to note that all of this work is happening and completed by the late 1930s into 1931, which was the Great Depression. So again, this is the completed building, a historic photo showing what it looked like back in the 50s. And this is the photograph of this building today. So we can see that this building essentially retained all of its characteristics since the time of construction. It's got its slate mansard roof, it's got its 5 original towers, crenellated parapets along one of the tower's peaked roofs. At the adjacent towers, you've got the traditional Tudor stucco infill with the gable, the faux gable mansard sloping roofs. There are coins that adorn the windows. The original wrought iron railings are all there. So essentially, this building is intact, except for the replacement of the windows, but they replaced them in the traditional 8/8 configuration. So this is important because from the state's perspective and from the federal landmarking perspective, this is a very pristine Tudor architecture. So just to talk a little bit about the village code. The village, actually, we're fortunate in Thomaston to actually have an ordinance that talks about the process of how a landmark gets reviewed and what the commission needs to do in order to approve or disapprove a landmark, a building, once it's been presented to them. So this is actually available on the internet. Everyone can log in and see it. It's section 120. The important thing that I wanted to point out here is this definition, because The definition of a landmark in Thomaston is not different from the definition of what the federal statute and the state ordinances and laws indicate. It says any site including significant trees or plant life located on a building or particular historic or aesthetic significance to the village, the town of North Hempstead, the county of Nassau, or the state of New York, or the United States. The term landmark includes sites, buildings, or structures. It includes buildings or structures where cultural, political, spiritual, economic, social, or artistic history of the community is reflected or exemplified. The important part is, or which embody the distinguishing characteristics of an architectural specimen, inherently valuable for representation of a period, style, or method of construction. So just looking back at the resource evaluation provided by New York State and these criteria in the language, again, criterion C, it says, embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or represents the work of a master, or possesses high artistic values, or represents a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. So that language compared to the Thomaston language is practically the same. And again, the state goes into describing Belgrave Motors. It's a significant building because of the Tudor Revival style, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is all available online. All of this is public information.
Who is it available from online?
This is on the CRIS system, Layla. So I can send you the links for it if you wanted to.
Yes, please, because I didn't understand what CRIS is. The others.
It's the Cultural Resource Information System of New York State. It's essentially the digitized website that provides all of the documents of any building that has been requested for determinations of eligibility in New York State and the associated documents.
Thank you. I'd appreciate it if you did send it to me.
Yeah, I'll send you a link so you can review all of this, and I'll send you these PDFs as well.
So can I just interject for a quick minute? I just want to let everyone know that we're recording this, and we're going to put it on our web page, which is called savegreatneck.org. So we're going to put it on the web page. Plus, if anyone wants it emailed to them, you can contact one of us. And
what web page?
savegreatneck.org.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So this is my final slide. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I will pass the baton over to Andrew, who will give us a little bit more of a broader perspective on preservation and adaptive reuse.
Thank you, Julie. So I will now share my screen. Oops, sorry. Okay. So in looking at the different types of landmarking laws, there is a bit of misinformation out there regarding what landmarking is and what it means for municipalities and owners of properties. Luckily, the law is very clear with ample precedent to support the designation and maintenance of landmarks. Landmarking has been upheld all the way to the Supreme Court as constitutional, even if some may not personally feel it is fair. Landmarking fosters civic pride and beauty and the noble accomplishments of the past. It is in all of our collective interest to ensure that the best parts of the past are kept for the future. And sort of looking at the different types of landmarking, we look at landmarking that is both at the local level and on the National Register of Historic Places. Notably, for the local level, owner approval is not required, while the National Register does require it. Local level, there is codified protection for historic properties that are privately owned, while the National Register is only honorific and does not provide any oversight except for certain instances with respect to environmental review. Additionally, at the local level, the landmarking is decided by a local board, a landmarking commissioners, while the National Register is done at the state level, and the Department of the Interior provides input as well as far as approval. Additionally, speaking of misinformation, there are quite a few myths surrounding landmarking that are very important to clarify in order to get the full facts on what landmarking means. There is the myth that historic properties are worth less when they are designated, and that is unfortunately not true. Empirical research across different communities across the country in both urban, suburban, and rural areas has shown that homes in historic districts, or homes that are landmarked, are actually worth more than those that are not when seen throughout the country, mostly because they are viewed as being more stable against change. Any change that is made is going to be appropriate and is going to reflect a harmonious neighborhood and streetscape. Another myth is that landmark properties are set in ember, which is also not true, because landmark properties have their changes regulated to be appropriate, in the sense that building a greenhouse glass addition next to a Tudor building would probably not fit well as a landmark property change, nor is a change that someone would want to do if they were willing to resell their property. And it would be hoped that most owners want to make changes and additions that are harmonious to what they have built in order to get the most value back in return. And lastly, there is the myth that landmark properties can never be demolished. And that is also not true, because there are cases of landmark properties that are demolished in many different areas. But generally, it is an effective curb to prevent needless demolition. And there are ways in certain circumstances to unfortunately circumvent that. But luckily, in general, properties are protected in a good way by being landmarked. And as I said, any changes that are made to be sympathetic and appropriate, as a landmarking protection provides. Looking at the Landmarks Commission of Thomaston, there is a sort of general makeup of boards that are model in type. The New York State has what they refer to as a certified local government program, which provides model law and legislation for municipalities to be really the best that they can be. And if we look at sort of what the state has provided for a commission, which is typically followed in robust municipalities that have landmarking commissions, they typically require that one must be a historian, one must be a real estate professional, one must be a strong historic preservation professional, one that has a very strong background in dealing with preservation as a technical standpoint. And lastly, all should have a known interest in preservation to begin with. So they are credentialed and able to give possible and very reasoned arguments on what historic merit is. And all these sorts of backgrounds that they bring really give sort of a cross-section of what is involved in preservation in terms of the different viewpoints. And while there is a balance for designation and property owner rights, the focus of the board is on designation. It is a preservation commission, not a demolition commission. And we should know that when this law was created by Thomaston, there was an clear intention by its framers and founders who wrote it to preserve the past and have qualified people make their determinations and opinions known. Looking directly at the landmarks law, it is laid out in the Village of Thomaston Code with a uniform process for landmarking with several steps. As homes are one of the most important financial assets, it is imperative to ensure that all processes are completed with due diligence. And sort of in short, the processes of the landmarks law state that the trustees of Thomaston can affirm or modify the recommendations that are given by the board. The designations that are made for landmarks affect only the exterior of a site. The interior is not covered by it. Owners are able to modify and adapt as they see fit to changing times, unlike New York City, which has a New York City landmarks law for the interior properties. Whoops, sorry. Landmark properties have demolition protection from just having a permit issued. Changes are approved by the commission. And additionally, while the commission is deliberating a landmark property, there is in a very useful sense, there is a freeze for demolition permits where 60 days, there are no permits that will be issued while a determination is made, which is a very useful step of protection. Additionally, upon landmarking, a plaque or a marker will be placed on the property to show the community what is designated. However, these markers are not a substitute for codified protection under the law. They are just for awareness for the public. While we have landmarks law, this is not a landmark. These plaques by the Great Neck Historical Society are not landmark plaques. They are honorific recognitions of historic properties which do not have any teeth for enforcement. So unfortunately, as lovely as many of these sites are, the owners could, the very next day after they're designated, tear them down or modify them as they see fit because they are purely honorific. In order to have real protection, it must be codified protection under the law. And luckily, Thomaston has a law to do that, and a commission which is currently debating the merits. Looking at, unfortunately, a very sad case study of what happens in municipalities that don't have a landmarking commission or a landmarks law, we must look at the former St. Ignatius Retreat House in Manhasset, which was in the village of North Hills. It was originally an estate of Nusfata, which was one of the largest homes of the entire nation. And
Wow.
it served from when it was an estate to 2013 as one of the largest homes in the country, and it was maintained impeccably. Unfortunately, people didn't know it really was there, and the municipality of North Hills is very averse to protection and reuse. Like Tower Ford, it was declared as eligible for the National Register, but North Hills had never surveyed their historic properties or enacted a landmarks law. Their lawyer, Thomas Levin, which is something we should keep in mind, is the same lawyer that Thomaston uses. And he had the view that there is nothing the village can do to prevent a lawful demolition permit under any circumstance. As someone who is undoubtedly pro-property rights, they had the same mentality to remove the only known oak tulip forest in Nassau County to build the Ritz-Carlton and North Hills complex. This is a forest of trees that was viewed as some of the rarest in New York State and one of the only samples in the county. Any impediment in the process of redevelopment is viewed as standing in the way of the notion of progress. This comes into play when you see this beautiful estate home that was reused for the community for all these years. It was maintained impeccably, a stunning example of architecture that was meritorious and not just the state, but probably in the national level and could have probably been a National Historic Landmark. It was put up for sale in 2013 with the idea of potential subdivision, meaning that it would be taken from the large 30 acres of land it was kept on and subdivided to build more homes on the property. And it was purchased by an anonymous, at the time, Hung Pace developer, and it was demolished in December of 2013. Despite being eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, North Hills refused to use their discretion, as villages have latitude of discretion, to intervene or allow a cool-off period to assess their options for review or reuse. And it could have been used as a clubhouse, it could have been converted to condominiums, offices, it could have had an amazing new life. As many other estates have done, about 100 are reused in some capacity. One down the corner, the Renaissance Country Club, the main house was turned into condominiums. But North Hills did not do that, and they did not feel that they needed to do that. And in fact, their mayor was on vacation in Florida when the permit was issued for demolition. Again, Thomas Levin, who was the Thomaston lawyer, was the attorney advising North Hills when this happened. It is a terrible tragedy, only comparable to the loss of Penn Station in New York City, that generations later will hopefully learn from. And unfortunately, I don't think we learned from it since. And the property was actually never built on, and it still has not been built on. It was actually resold a couple of weeks ago for, I think, $80 million. So nothing has been built there, but the house is gone forever. Luckily, in the case of Tower Ford, we are on the case, doing in-depth scholarly research to find out the history and the background of the building. And while we don't know who the architect is, we are currently researching the possibility that it was a very famous practitioner named James W. O'Connor, who was a friend of the Grace family that developed Belgrave Square. In short, O'Connor was educated at Columbia University and the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which was considered the premier architectural school of its time. After graduation, he was a draftsman in the firm of Kim Mead and White, as people might know from Stanford White, the architect, where he honed his skills, and he entered the architectural world a few years later through William Russell Grace, W.R. Grace, who had O'Connor design their family estates and office buildings. O'Connor designed around 1,000 works of architecture in his career, and he was given the highest honor from the Architectural League of New York for meritorious contribution to the architectural profession. Very briefly, point out that the estate here was designed for J. Peter Grace in Tullaroan in North Hills, which is now the Deepdale Golf Club. It is their clubhouse. And below it is another estate built for Lawrence Hobart Shearman, who was a vice president of W.R. Grace, also in North Hills. It is now the Buckley Day School. So those are some of his works, and he was very well tied to the Grace family. Additional works that O'Connor designed in the neighboring Great Neck Plaza is the Thomaston building, which was actually built as apartments and is now used as office space. And the Belgrave Motors is very similar to it in the sense that it also has Juliet balconies and circular windows at top. Another Great Neck Plaza landmark is the Grace Building, which additionally has those balconies and a Flemish bond brick design. There was definitely a dialogue between the Grace buildings and the Belgrave Motors building, which is around basically down the street. And both these two buildings are Great Neck Plaza landmarks. As Great Neck Plaza, which is just the neighboring village to the north, took advantage of the time and grant money which was offered by the state to survey many of their sites. They have over 40 places documented in great detail, and the significant ones are protected as landmarks from inappropriate demolition or alteration. The surveying that they did allows a detailed look at what is or is not historic and allows the village to make informed decisions on land use. As a note, the Great Neck Plaza Village was actually honored by the White House in the early 2000s for their meritorious work in preservation. Seems like not just Long Island, but the nation itself is watching what we do here in great anticipation. The surveys, just to give a little bit of an example of what the surveys that they did showed, was sort of a background on the history, who the architects were for the buildings, their architectural features, and the sort of the merit that they have as potential landmarks. And they found they had some very important buildings there, and they were very fortunate to landmark many of them, which is a very welcome progress for them. Unfortunately, on the other hand, one building that comes up again and again in any discussion of preservation is the Great Neck Playhouse, which was left abandoned for nearly 10 years and was allowed to be demolished just recently. Many ask, how could this happen? Well, being in the village of Great Neck Estates, which is separate from the village of Thomaston and separate from the village of Great Neck Plaza, Great Neck Estates has no landmarks law for even a famed theater that was one of Great Neck's most significant sites, and possibly its most well-known historic site. While it could have been wonderfully reused as apartments, there was nothing to protect it from demolition by neglect and a simple permit. Without a strong historical society for advocacy, there's little to be done. And speaking to their historian, Ilse Kagan, who is currently 93, she described in great detail that this was Great Neck's biggest shame, the loss of the building. And while it was left vacant, it was not because of a landmarks law. It was left vacant due to neglect. And unfortunately, many owners know that demolition by neglect is very powerful. And you'll see that in many buildings, unfortunately, throughout Great Neck, none of which are landmarked properties. On the bright side, as we look to the bright side, this year's Pritzker Prize, which is known as the Nobel Prize for Architecture, the winner, Anne Lecton and Jean-Philippe Vassal, have never demolished a building. They see it as an act of vandalism and choose to transform what already exists instead. This is very fitting in light of the current climate crisis in which we are in. It has been said many times, the most green building, which is even more green than LEED certification, which rates the greenness of a building, is the one that already is built. And they do a great job of reusing historic buildings. One concept that cannot be overstated is the beauty and value of adaptive reuse when a building is converted from its original use to a new one. This can be done in really any building and in any style with a bit of ingenuity. It may not be as easy to do, but it is sustainable and gives a certain value that new construction doesn't have. It is most strongly suggested that Thomaston and his residents only accept full adaptive reuse and nothing less. The Belgrave Motors building could become really anything, from retail to apartments to educational or additional religious use. Looking at New York City, some of its most successful sites, from the High Line, Chelsea Market, the Public Theater, and the Empire Stores in Dumbo, are all reused sites, and they become iconic as a result. As a brief sort of survey of different properties and their new uses, in New York City, CVS Pharmacy at 81 8th Avenue was a bank and is now reused beautifully as a pharmacy. And it is done so because it is both landmarked on the exterior and the interior. And the interior has remained intact after multiple tenants. And it is regulated as such. It's wonderful. Further uptown, the Joseph A. Martino Hall of Fordham University Lincoln Center used to be an automated garage and is now used as a dormitory. Even dealerships and parking garages can have new useful lives through reuse. Back on Long Island, the beloved Lord & Taylor in Manhasset, which is the first branch department store in America, is being converted literally as we speak, and they probably were working today, from retail to offices. It is proof that adaptive reuse is a concept that is still timely, still prominent, and still valued as an option for reinvigorating historic buildings. Looking at Great Neck, many of its buildings are also reused, and they have a long record of repurposing historic sites. Wiley Hall at the United States Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point on Steamboat Road was originally the estate of Henry Bendel by Henry Otis Chapin, and it is now their administration building. The current location, the Village School on Middle Neck Road, was built as the Union Chapel, Great Neck's first church. They have used it continually since 1970, and before the school was there, it was used as a youth center. They have stayed and they have not decided to move out after all these years. It fits their needs well. Looking at specific former car dealerships that are now reused, 80 Middle Neck Road was built as a Lamoth dealership, which sold Cadillac cars. The front portion is now retail, and the service area behind it is now a collision center. Lastly, 435 Middle Neck Road, or the Wedding Cake Building, as many people call it, was designed in 1931 as an Oldsmobile dealer and Gulf service station. It is now commercial space. In Roslyn, a very strong comparison to the Belgrade Motors building, or Tower Ford, is the former Roslyn Motors, which was designed by Henry W. Johansson as a Lincoln showroom. As it is landmarked as part of a planned scenic overlay district for Roslyn, it has been maintained and retained as apartments with retail below. As you think about the future, it is important to look back at the past and the impact that even single individuals can have in creating positive change. The Jerrys, who are pictured, came to the village of Roslyn in the 1950s when it was on the brink of obliteration, but they saw it as a rich landscape waiting to be appreciated. Beyond being residents, they became citizens. The Jerrys established Roslyn's first local history collection. They initiated a yearly 14-house tour series. They established a landmark board and, most importantly, activated their community to be relentless in protecting their heritage. And they truly have been relentless. It was the project of a lifetime, and their legacy is one that is still felt today, with Roslyn as an appreciated, beloved model for all of New York State. We must look to the past to look forward. When you look at Great Neck Plaza and you look at Roslyn, it looks that amazing for a reason. Some people, like you and I, had the foresight to protect it. It is nothing sensational. There's a lot of talk about making America and, conversely, Great Neck great again. What if the greatness that is already here, what if the greatness that we desire is already here for us? My question for all of you is simple. Why should Thomaston not be just as great, a beacon of beautiful streets that exude pride for residents and visitors alike? Why should we not also be a model for good governance and preservation? All it takes is the political will and unrelenting spirit of its residents. This is your chance to make a new history for Thomaston, and it is up to us to see how it goes. Thank you all for watching and listening. So just very quickly,
And
we'll
how
show
about Lee Seaman? Talk about a landmark.
a living landmark, just
Yep,
like you, Dr. Siegel.
but she could have.
Somebody brought up Lee Seaman today. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I do.
Okay.
Yeah, and she's very active in Jewish history archives. She's now 90 something, and they just renamed the street, Bond Street, between Grace and Maple, Lee Seaman Way. She's been a public servant and a councilwoman. And
That's where I
honored-
just saw that the other day. Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, so that was Sunday. And Tom DiNapoli is, she's very close with Tom, so.
Okay, Andrew, you ready to go?
Yep, I am. So going a little bit off my cuff here with this, but so that, and I believe in out east is what used to be a Bulova watch factory, for people who remember when Bulova was in its prime. And after they sort of consolidated their operations, they were left with this sort of abandoned derelict industrial factory, and it was converted into condominiums. This is actually, for the time, one of the premier preservation projects on the island, and it's done a really fantastic job of reinvigorating what was really industrial architecture. The large windows were repurposed, and it's seen as an asset to the community, and it's a wonderful, wonderful project. Another example of reuse of kind of an unexpected example is in Long Island City. The Powerhouse condominiums are repurposing what used to be a turbine hall for the, I think, the Long Island Railroad. This is a McKim Mead and White building, and once I think when it went electric, it wasn't needed. So of course, like many great buildings do, they've been converted. And in this case, it wasn't, I don't think, the best example of reuse because there was a bit of infill at the top, but the interior was taken out. It was just a large hall, and it had floors put in and is now used as apartments. And it's another really good example. And these sort of, it's supposed to represent the smokestacks at the top. That's what they're doing in glass. Over by me in Manhasset, as I said, Great Neck is not my home, though I feel like my family would have grown up in Great Neck if we had a choice. On Woodland Boulevard, across from Lord and Taylor, was the Christ Church Parish House at 1355 Northern Boulevard. And it was slated for demolition, but the Manhasset community prevailed and had it reused. At the front, it serves a purpose as a daycare for the community, and it is also used as medical offices, ophthalmologist offices, and on the right-hand side out of view in the photo that I took is the parish house for Christ Church. So it has not only found a new life as a reused purpose, but it actually serves 3 purposes, and it's actively in use. It's now an asset from what could have been just rubble. And it's a lovely Gothic building. It's I think I remember being in there as a kid for piano lessons. Also on the Merchant Marine campus, going back to Great Neck, is the American Merchant Marine Academy Museum, one of Great Neck's hidden treasures. For those who've not been there, it is one of the greatest museums, I think, on Long Island. They have some of the true artifacts of history there, but this was an estate for William Barstow. And perhaps through necessity, it has been reused and the interior has been retained. They've done a fantastic job, despite the very slim budget that the Department of Transit gives the Merchant Marines. They are not a military branch, they're under the Transit Department. It is on the National Register, and it has just been fantastically preserved on the inside. It's really quite a gem.
My husband went there
Oh,
back in the 70s. Yeah.
Also in North Hills, or what really was considered Lakeville at the time, in Great Neck, is an estate that I mentioned before for W.R. Grace's son, J. Peter Grace, named Tullaroan. And here it is in its present day form as the clubhouse of the Deepdale Golf Club. And it is a beloved clubhouse from members Michael Bloomberg, the Marin family, who very wealthy family, I think Tom Brokaw. It's one of the great golf clubs of Long Island, and they've done a really fantastic job of preserving not only the building, but the landscape as well. Another photo of the other building that both these were Grace designed buildings, built for the Grace family and interests and designed by James O'Connor. The other one is the Buckley Country Day School, which was built for Lawrence Hobart Shearman. They've also preserved it as well, and they've expanded it with a large addition, I think by Bentel and Bentel. But again, these two have gone from residential, been maintained beautifully on the inside and the outside, and they have new productive lives for the community, and they're really fantastic. Great Neck, Kensington, their village hall is in the former carriage house of an estate named Bonnie Mancy, which was built for one of the developers of Rickard Findlay, who developed Kensington. After the house burned down, the main house, they have used the carriage house as the village hall ever since. And that was the village hall back in October. Great Neck Estates, their village hall was a mansion for Charles Atwater, and they have not only preserved the house, they have enclosed porches. Around the corner is an enclosed porch for a records room, I believe. And if you go in, the inside, what used to be probably the living room or dining room, has the original furniture in it, which is a really neat touch. They have occupied it since the family left, and they still do today. Great Neck Village. Their village hall was an 1800s, I believe, farmhouse for the Baker family, which is why the Baker Elementary School behind it is named after E.M. Baker. I understand that they're actually giving it to the Great Neck Public Schools for their use, but they have, again, they occupied this building for many, many years of their village hall, and they have preserved it in a very strong manner. Additionally, the village of Lake Success, which is bordering Great Neck and is almost part of Great Neck, their village hall is in a clubhouse for the Deepdale estate of William Vanderbilt. And this was a Warren and Wetmore design, the same architects as Grand Central Terminal. Great Neck, the village of Lake Success has occupied it as their village hall. And there's again another estate that has made advantage of these buildings and have reused them. Down the street, the Great Neck Public Schools occupies the former Phipps estate of Bonnie Blink, and it was donated to the Great Neck School District by the family, and they have maintained it a very high degree. They're still there to this day and have built around it. Over in Kings Point, there is the former, as you enter the Kenilworth development, there is a small lodge to the left-hand side of the entry.
I've been
and
inside that years ago. Beautiful little cottage.
It was the sales office for the Kenilworth development. And instead of demolishing what would typically, in many of these cases, be temporary structures, it has been repurposed, and I believe it's used by probably the caretaker of the development, or it's a private residence. This was by, I think, Patterson and King. But again, another example of reuse. Down closer to East Shore Road is the Chabad of Great Neck. Well, I don't know the exact lineage of the estate that is there. This is a 1930s estate home, Dutch colonial revival. And they built further down towards the water a modern building, but they've retained this one as perhaps administrative offices. Additionally, and further up as you go up north,
Cow Lane.
Yes, Cow Lane, I believe, and East Shore Road is a 1800s barn, which is actually used as a school at one point and is now converted to a beautiful home. And there's actually a sprawling complex of multiple buildings, but they have found a new use and they've been maintained really beautifully in Kings Point. Also, the beloved, I'm blanking on the name of the park, Stepping Stone Park next to the Merchant Marine Academy. The sort of amenity house that is there was a carriage house for Mademoiselle Olga Petrova, and it was later owned by Walter Chrysler's son. And they donated it to Kings Point, where it now serves as part of the park. And that is actually the last example of reuse that I have. But these are just, again, few snapshots of reuse that Great Neck has embraced and preserved for many years. And they become viable and vital parts of our community that people will love. And I think if you were to demolish the house for the Stepping Stone Park or the Merchant Marine Museum, people would be up in arms because they know and they love them. And they're part of what makes Great Neck so great in many, many ways.
Thank you, Andrew. And I could name a few that I know have gone the way of demolition. But, you know, demographics change, and have seen that so greatly impact our peninsula. So, but I do believe you have to educate to activate.
Well, the beautiful thing about landmarks is that it is really immune to demographic change. Once something is protected, it has that codified status and people who are able to give informed opinions on what its future should be. And that's something that we've seen in Great Neck Plaza, we've seen in Kings Point for the landmarks that they have designated. We've seen that extensively in Roslyn. that it has remained viable and beautiful despite all the change of this time. And I believe and I have all faith that those places will remain even into my generation as someone who will inherit what we have left. And that's really because they are landmarked. And without that, you would not see what you see today.
Well, I think that unless anybody else has any questions or comments, then we will shut it down for the evening. And we have recorded this, which is excellent. So we'll be able to post it on the website at savegreatneck.org. And also we'll be able to email it a link to anybody who's interested in seeing it again or spreading the word.
Can we edit the part about my medical issues?
Probably a few parts we could edit.
Yeah.
But thank you very much, Andrew and Julie, for this presentation. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your interest and your time.
Thank you, everyone, and we hope that you will be present on January 4th. Hopefully, we'll be able to push it out a few weeks beyond that so it doesn't interfere with the holiday celebrations of everyone. So
Stay safe, stay well. We'll see y'all.
thank you.
Please be
Thank you.
active, please be informed, and please all speak your mind. This is your village and your future, and it takes all of us to be involved, even if you don't live here.
Thank you, Andrew and Julie.
Thank you.
Can I add one final comment?
Sure.
My name is Bruce Spunk. I live at 160 Middle Neck Road, Kenwood Gardens. I live in this building. I am the historian. It is designated as a landmark in Great Neck as the oldest co-op presently on Long Island. It was built in 1925, completed by 1927. I relate so much to what Andrew said with regard to the edifices of all of these wonderful buildings that exist. We have our own pride in our own building with existing floors, ceilings, fireplaces, tiling from the 20s. And I can appreciate so much more listening, having attended last night as well as tonight. And I are so much in favor of retaining the Ford Tower building. I will pass the word and see how much we can get in that favor. Andrew, your presentation was extremely enlightening, and I'm so much more prideful. Just as an added addition, the Village Hall of Great Neck Estates was once located in our lobby in the early 20s, in 27. So it served the purpose then as it does now. Thank you very much for that great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go into questions, I thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Julie. First of all, before we go into some questioning, I see that we have Nancy Solomon on the Zoom here, and I don't know, Nancy, if you would like to say anything about the work that you had done in the neighboring village of Great Neck Plaza with respect to landmarking and what you know about the Thomaston building.
Well,
I mean, at the Thomaston building, I mean Tower Ford. Yeah.
sure. Well,
Well, for those, some of you I know and many of you I don't. I was the preservation consultant to the Village of Great Neck Plaza from the early 2000s up until about 2012, 2013. And I've still maintained, relationships, with the village trustees and former Mayor Gene Cellender. And I think, in all facets of what the village was able to do was really at the spiritual enlightenment by Gene Cellender of the trustees. And she was very fortunate in having, a committed group of people, that were selected, for the Historic Preservation Commission, some of whom I suggested, but also some of whom she suggested. And it was really, like one of those marriages made in heaven that I don't know if will ever be replicated, in other places. So I would, she basically, she hired me, to do that survey. I was able to get some Columbia graduate students to assist me because my background is more in the social history and historical research rather than architectural understandings, but I've learned along the way from many people. And what we were able to do is to really, bring in the community, through doing oral histories about their memories, about their experiences. If you go on that village, that Andrew was showing, there are some audio clips from the interviews that we did where people, could recount them. And so as a result of that, there were always, a steady group of residents that would turn out for anything that the commission was recommending for designation. And it really became, something very powerful. That said, there was also some resistance. So you'll notice that most of what is landmarked in the Village of Great Neck Plaza is commercial and economic producing properties. The residential co-ops, they did not want to be landmarked, and they have not been. So it's a little scary because the first one that we really wanted to landmark was the Witchwood building, which was designed by Schwartz and Gross, who wouldn't surprise me if they were also might have been the architects for Belgrade Motors, because they were Park Avenue architects. They were in the same circles as Grace. And they were building this, the Witchwood, their gardens were designed by Frederick Law Olmsted's firm. So there was a lot of, crossover among the architects and the movers and shakers that were, Thomaston and Great Neck. And William R. Grace was very much in those circles. So I don't know if we'll ever find out who actually built Belgrade Motors, but it wouldn't surprise me if Schwartz and Gross might have been involved, since they were just down the street at the Witchwood. So, all of your presentations, both Julie and Andrew, you really described the process incredibly well. And, to me, I'm like, why didn't Thomaston become what's called a certified local government, where they could have gotten grant money to do a whole survey, and, to train, the commission members. We did a lot of commission member trainings, in Great Neck. I think, Simeon, weren't you involved in some of those trainings?
You brought me in to do them. Yep, indeed.
Yeah, I had a feeling. I vaguely remember that. So there was, really, a passion and an understanding that, this is, requires background and information. It's not all just legal stuff. It's also about the history of different styles, and it's also about the history of communities. And one of the things that, I was curious, when the SHPA, the State Historic Preservation Office, issued its Declaration of Eligibility, why didn't they also consider criteria A, which is the history part of designating buildings? Because I think there's a ton of history connected, with that building, but maybe they just didn't have the time, and it was easy, so they could just say, oh yeah, you look at it and yes, there you go. So that's something that could easily be added to that determination. You know, there was a lot of automobile development going on. There were a number of auto dealerships, as we've seen, you know, the Cadillac dealership, the Oldsmobile dealership, you know, further up in Great Neck. And certainly the extension of Hempstead Turnpike is becoming a major thoroughfare. And there was a whole business centered environment around the automobile in downtown Great Neck. So I'm sure that led to, you know, one of the reasons why that building was created and why they decided to be there. You know, you had all the Gold Coast estates and people who were, you know, excited about taking their new cars out from the city and coming to Long Island and going to people's parties and to the parks. So it's certainly a very worthwhile historical structure as well as an architectural structure. Anyway, those are my thoughts off the top of my head, and you know, we can talk more about, you know, getting that information at the January 4th hearing.
Thank you.